It's time for Herd Mentality, the weekly episode where you control the discussion today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino from the Draft Network, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Happy Tuesday to you, and thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day. And as a reminder to you, we are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. It's BetOnline, and it's where the game starts. Well, folks, it's time for Herd Mentality. Tons of great questions this week. Once again, did my best to kind of sort through them and pick the most popular talking points that you guys wanted me to touch on. And so hopefully I've done a good job of doing that. I do also like to remind everyone that I am recording this before Sean McDermott speaks to the media on Monday afternoon. So any big updates that he provides in that press conference will not be reflected in the knowledge that I have to answer the questions today. I don't think there's going to be anything that he's going to say that's really going to make a difference, but I always like to point that out. Let's get into it. First one today comes from Vin. Vin says, a few thoughts of mine as I watched the game. Pickett and company were eating Elam's lunch all afternoon. This game has to boost the yak for the season. Yak is yards after catch. And seemed that all the wide receivers did good, and Allen hit them in stride a lot. Is Shakir already a better fit as an every-down player over McKenzie? I do love the face of the franchise, but Shakir looked great. All right, so some things to unpack here, and these are pretty common things that kind of came up through a lot of different questions. So we're going to spend a little time here kind of breaking this down. Starting with Kair Elam. Yes, he gave up a fair amount of yardage in coverage. They went after him, and he gave up some completions, and kind of expected it, right? That's why I predicted his first career interception in this game, because I knew stylistically this was the type of game that the Steelers would have to play offensively, and what they want to do. It's isolating those receivers, moving the pocket, and testing the coverage. And the Bills are typically a defense that is willing to concede some things underneath, rally and tackle, and they don't want to get beat over the top. And kind of just thinking about Elam as a player and adjusting to more zone coverage and knowing when to kind of trigger downhill when he's got deep third responsibilities, I kind of expected this. And so I'm glad that it happened in a game where it didn't cost the Bills, right? He was able to kind of go through some of those challenges, and the Bills won 38-3. It was a good game to, quote unquote, fail forward. That's something that I used to speak a lot about regarding Josh Allen back in 2018, his rookie season. I obviously wasn't doing this podcast until January of 2019, but if I would have done the podcast in 2018, you would have heard me say the words fail forward as it relates to Josh Allen a ton. And maybe I did some in 2019. I don't remember that piece of it, but that's where I go with this Kair Elam thing. You got to go through some of these struggles. You got to be challenged in different ways. And I'm glad that it happened in a game where it really didn't cost the Bills. And I think if nothing else, it's going to be a good game for him to go back and learn a lot from. And I'm happy about that. As for Khalil Shakir, yeah, I mean, great performance, right? I think a lot of us expected him to develop into a meaningful piece of the offense. The glimpses were there in preseason, and obviously a really strong showing in this game. I don't think you have to go to that place where you start to say, well, is he going to help this offense more than Isaiah McKenzie? I think Isaiah McKenzie is a very different player than Khalil Shakir, as a player that you can get horizontally, a player that has good chemistry with Josh Allen. You love him on the over routes. You know, there's a lot that McKenzie can bring to the offense. And so I think you just say, wow, we're lucky to have all these skill sets. Let's get them all going in different ways to attack defenses. And I don't think you have to diminish McKenzie to appreciate Shakir. Get them all going and build a really complete offense in terms of the way you can attack defenses with your different wide receivers. Your last point there that I want to get into is the yards after catch. Yeah, this was a big time yards after catch game for the Bills. Obviously, Gabe Davis on the the long touchdown, right? A lot of yards after catch. But then you think about how that regulates a little bit on his second touchdown, which there's no yards after catch. But collectively, a really good effort. The Bills, 9.6 yards after catch per reception in this game. Gabriel Davis, 22.7 yards. Quentin Morris, 9.7. Khalil Shakir, 8.7. Stefon Diggs, 8.4. And even Isaiah Hodgins, 5.3. That's really good, right? So it certainly is assisted by the big run after catch from Gabe Davis, but everybody was really above 5.3. And that's a good place to be. 5.5 is where I want it for Josh Allen. I think that's a good spot for his yards after catch to be. That puts him right at about middle of the pack, maybe towards the 10 to 15 range when you look at historical yards after catch numbers. And this game for the season gets him to 5.4. So it wasn't good the previous 4 games. And then this one, it really kind of balloons. And, that's just kind of how things will average out. But if he stays in that 5.5 range, that's exactly where I wanted Josh Allen. And I think that a game like this every once in a while, or maybe some of this game and some what you saw in the past kind of blended together, allows you to stay at about this point. You're not going to get 9.6 very often. But if you can have, some more 5, 6, 7 type games, you'll see how that production just really kind of comes together. And Josh Allen doesn't have to do everything in terms of air yards. So really good sign here based on this game. All right, let's move on to Neil's question. Neil says, it's crazy looking at the list of defensive linemen and edge rushers the Bills offensive line has taken on this year, and considering how well they've performed against such talent. Aaron Donald, Jeffrey Simmons, Davis, Wilkins, Phillips, Campbell, Jones, Owe, and now Cameron Hayward / Alex Smith. I think major props needs to go to that unit and Cromer for withstanding that battery of dudes. But now this week, they have another tall task with Chris Jones, Frank Clark, and George Karlaftis. If you were to rank the opponent's defensive line challenges from week 1 through week 6, where do you slot the Chiefs' defensive line among the group? Jones in particular has given us fits in the past. So yes, this is a really fun. I have the rankings. I'm going to go 1 through 6 here for you. But first, I do want to provide a number here that really kind of ties everything together that Neil was communicating in his question. And it's that, according to Pro Football Reference, Josh Allen is pressured on the lowest percentage of his dropbacks in the NFL so far at 12.1%. That's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. If it stays there, Josh is going to break the passing record. I promise you that. And so it's been like, for as disappointed as we've been about the run blocking, the pass blocking's been awesome. And so here's where I would stack Kansas City in terms of defensive line challenges for the Bills as a pass blocking unit offensively. And I put them right there at number 1. It's Chris Jones. You mentioned him. He's a game wrecker. They got a nice first round pick in George Karlaftis. You mentioned Frank Clark, but they also have Carlos Dunlap, who's a really nice player as well. They've got some depth players in Tashawn Wharton and Michael Dana that I have respect for. I think the Chiefs just have a lot of depth, a lot of skill sets, a lot of power, a lot of length, and they present a lot of problems up front. So I think this is going to be the biggest test for the Bills pass blocking so far this season coming up on Sunday. At number 2, and I know the Bills did fairly well, but I'd put the Miami Dolphins. Christian Wilkins, Melvin Ingram, Emmanuel Ogbah, Jalen Phillips, Zach Sealer. They got a lot of players as well. Number 3, the Titans. Simmons, Dupree, and Autry. That's pretty good. If they have Landry, that's a really good situation. The Rams at number 4. Aaron Donald, and then what, right? Leonard Floyd, Terrell Lewis. Aaron Donald himself gives this a lot of merit, but they need more. At 5, I put the Steelers, Highsmith, and Hayward. They don't have a whole lot else besides them, but Hayward's obviously a really good player. And then number 6, I put the Ravens with Jason Owe, Jason Pierre-Paul, and Calais Campbell. Jay Ham says, is this the best tackling defense you've seen from McDermott's Bills? Love this question because the answer to that is emphatically yes. This is 1,000,000% the best tackling defense I've ever seen under Sean McDermott for the Buffalo Bills. And the numbers do tell the story here. The Bills have 13 missed tackles so far this season, according to Pro Football Reference, which is 3rd fewest in the NFL. And if you've listened to this podcast over the years, you've heard me criticize the Bills' defense for not being a good tackling defense. Well, they are now, but it hasn't always been the case. Last year, they were 10th worst. In 2020, they were 6th worst. In 2019, they were 3rd worst. In 2018, they were 2nd worst. So they've been among the top 10 worst tackling defense for the last 4 years before this year. Now, you got to keep it up. But right now, this Bills defense is tackling at a rate of consistency way higher than we've ever seen. And that's big. And if you remember the conversations we had, it was like, man, this Bills defense is statistically really, really good. Just imagine if they stopped giving up so much additional yardage from missing tackles. So, yes, J-Ham's great item to bring up, and I'm glad I have an opportunity to kind of give some credit here because this is a very underrated component of this Bills football team that has really come together quite well. Brian says, with how Khalil Shakir looked yesterday, could we see more 4 wide receiver sets when McKenzie is healthy? McKenzie in the past would take reverse plays and maybe otherwise involved in the run game. Feels like those two together with McKenzie sort of playing a Debo role could really open things up on the shorter end of the field if defenses want to play back. Brian, yes, absolutely. I want this. I want more 10 personnel. I got to be honest with you. For as creative as I liked and enjoyed the personnel groupings that Ken Dorsey has deployed earlier this season, I like Josh in 10 personnel. I like him with 3+ receivers on the field, at least 3 on every snap when you're going to pass the ball. I feel like that's when he's at his best. And so I like the ability to mix and match personnel and do different things, but I like the receivers on the field. And if you go to Sunday against the Steelers, and I don't have all the data here to really give you the personnel groupings, but I can tell you that Reggie Gilliam only played 7 offensive snaps. And to me, that says less 2-back stuff. And I like that. I like less 2-back stuff for the Bills. Now, you still want Reggie Gilliam to be a piece of your offense, but I don't like as much 2-back. Give me more 2 tight end. Give me more 3 and 4 receiver, but 2-backs, I don't love it. I don't love that. So, and I think you can point to the Steelers game as probably the least frequent amount of 2-backs that we've seen from Dorsey, and obviously the Bills scored at will. So, yeah, I'm about some 10 and 11 personnel for sure. Fall is chaos in your pants. You're overheating 1 second and freezing the next. To be ready for anything, you need underwear that can handle everything. It's time for Tommy John underwear. In Tommy John underwear, you're that much more comfortable so you can do everything better. Tommy John's breathable, lightweight fabric has 4 times the stretch of competing brands. They come with a no wedgie guarantee, thanks to a non-rolling waistband and legs that never ride up. Plus, they feature a horizontal quick draw fly. With over 17 million pairs sold, people love Tommy John underwear, and that's why Tommy John doesn't have customers. They have fanatics. I personally love wearing my Tommy John underwear because of how breathable and comfortable it is, and you should get Tommy John too. Plus, everything is backed with Tommy John's best pair you'll ever wear, or it's free guarantee. So go to TommyJohn.com/lockedon right now for 20% off your first order. That's 20% off at TommyJohn.com/lockedon. TommyJohn.com/lockedon. See site for details. All right, the next one today comes from AJ. AJ says, do you think we will see Xavier Rhodes at all this season on the active roster? Even with White and Benford coming back in the near future and Elam/Jackson playing well, I think it would be great to have him as a depth player. We still have games against Kansas City, Green Bay, Minnesota, Miami, and Cincinnati, all teams with excellent playmakers on the outside. I think Rhodes could help us out against teams like that, even if it's for a few snaps per game. AJ, I hope we don't. I hope we don't see Xavier Rhodes this season. Obviously, right now, he can't really help the team because he's got a hamstring injury and he's on the injured list for the practice squad. And so he's not available to help. But, if Xavier Rhodes is on this roster, that means that you got some injuries. You had some significant injuries. Because right now, even with their current state, they're kind of getting by at corner and getting some good experience for these young players. And so if it comes down to it, I'm glad that Xavier Rhodes exists, But I'm not putting them out there unless you're in a situation where a bunch of guys got hurt, and I'm not hoping for that at all. Mountain Man says, are the Bills victims of their own success? Fans calling into WGR on Twitter complaining about how the Bills should have won by more against the Steelers, as if a 5-touchdown margin of victory isn't enough. But are we holding them to too high of a standard, as if we expect them to be perfect? It's hard to be perfect, as we know, in the NFL. I appreciate this question, Mountain Man, because it's been really interesting kind of navigating the discussion surrounding the Bills and some of the engagements with Bills Mafia. I think we all understand that this is a phenomenal football team, right, that we think can go all the way. But that leads to some really interesting discourse. And even the way that people have responded to my analysis has been very different this year compared to previous years, where it feels like anything that I have to say that isn't gloating about how good the Bills are, people are pushing back and are upset with me. So I've kind of felt this as well. And part of what I want to do is give you an objective look at this team. I don't hide from being a Buffalo Bills fan, but I want to be honest about what I'm seeing. And so much of what I have to say is good, but it's amazing to me the 3, 4, 5% of things that can be better that I talk about that people are like, well, that doesn't matter, right? Somebody even said, like, because I criticized Josh Allen for one-hopping the game-winning touchdown pass to Isaiah McKenzie against Miami, they said, well, you should go out there and make that throw and see if you can do it. What? Sometimes the team doesn't do everything perfect. And it's such a weird spot to be, because obviously the Bills were not good for so long, and we're really kind of getting used to being the standard of the NFL and the expectations that come with it. And I think there's a piece of that from the fan side that you kind of have to adapt to as well. You know, it's like you think about that Dolphins loss, right? And Dolphins fans were celebrating, right? They were celebrating like Appalachian State when they beat Texas A&M. And as a Bills fan, you're like, well, damn, I hate losing the game, but you just know that you're going to play all 17 of them and see what happens, right? And you like what you got. And that's kind of what I said at the end of that podcast. It's like, well, look, this kind of sucked, but let's play them all and see what happens, right? Like there's a settling in as a fan base that's required when your team is like this, and it's uncharted territory for a lot of us. So I think just as this team has evolved and become among the elite teams in the league, and the expectations that come with it, you know, it's changed our discourse in a lot of different ways. And so let's still be aware that this is the NFL. The Bills are awesome. They're an elite team. They can go all the way. We all believe that, right? What's understood doesn't have to be explained. We get that. And so sometimes I find myself more interested in talking about, okay, what opportunities are there for this team to evolve and get better and change and, you know, clean up some things that could hurt them in other games. The Pittsburgh Steelers just got beat by the Bills 38-3, and I still wanted to take time to talk about, hey, these things didn't go well. They didn't cost the Bills. They won the game by a lot, but in other situations, you can lose because of these things. It happened against Miami. The Bills outgained them by 300 yards, but you still lost a football game. And I know that there's context there, right? The injuries, the heat, all that stuff. But we have to be able to look at this team in its entirety, or else we're just not going to have good discussions about this football team. So let's enjoy it. I mean, this is, as my buddy Joe Miller puts it, wildest dreams land for what this team is and what they offer to us. And we have high expectations, and there's so much to celebrate. There's so much to be proud of. But I think you still have to be able to look at this team objectively and understand that this is rare. You don't boat race teams like this all the time in the NFL. The Bills have done it 3 times this year already in 5 games. Killed the opponent. That's not normal. That's not normal. 51 or 52% of games in the NFL are decided by one score. The Bills are out here winning 38-3, 31-10. Whatever that final score was against Tennessee, not normal. Got a special football team. A special football team. And it's hard to do that, right? Like, not every team can go out and do that. Maybe the Steelers are an undermanned football team, but average NFL teams aren't going out there and beating them 38-3. You didn't even play the fourth quarter. You had 2 teams this year that quit before the fourth quarter in the Steelers and Titans. So, yeah, when it goes right for the Bills, they can destroy anyone. But let's just remember that that's not normal. Let's enjoy this. Let's enjoy this. Let's enjoy this. But let's also see everything. Let's have good. We're going to have them on this podcast. I'll tell you that. We're going to have good conversations about the team, about everything, not just everything that goes well. The next one comes from Sean, who says, how big of a transition is it from cornerback to safety? If, and this is a big if, they play from Elam, Jackson, and Benford when healthy continues to be strong, could Tre White play some safety to work his way back into the lineup? I know he is paid like and plays like a top-tier corner, but I feel like some of his ball skills and mental game could be helpful at the back end of the defense in place of Micah Hyde. I'm going to push back on this. I'll be honest with you. And I know that you mentioned in here about he's paid like and plays like a top-tier corner. That's because he is. That's where he's best. I want to play him where he's at his best. Tre White's one of the most special corners in the league. And I know that we hadn't seen him play since Thanksgiving last year, but he's phenomenal. He's phenomenal. He's a math changer. That's what I like to call him. When you have players that change the math based on how you can space the field, right? Whether that's a pass rusher up front, a defensive back that changes things, a quarterback, a receiver, right? That you can dictate terms because you have that player. It's big. And Tre White's an all-pro corner, and he's dynamic there, and he's awesome. Like, he's a really, really good football player. And so I'm going to think about all the other players moving to a different spot to get him on the field before I think about Tre White. And here's the other piece of this with Tre White and playing safety. The biggest concern that I would have about that is, for all that I love about Tre White, all right, I love Tre White, one of my most favorite players that I've had on the Bills in my lifetime. He's not a great tackler. He's not. He's never been a great tackler. And as my last line of defense, Tre White has to tackle better before I put him at safety. And so that's always kind of been the question in my head, because I've received this question from the other side of things that's more like, hey, when Tre White ages and maybe he doesn't have the athleticism to play at corner, could he be a safety in time? And to which I say, yeah, in time later on, but also after he proves that he could be a better tackler. So that's my thoughts on all that. Robert says the Bills don't have a receiver drafted before the 4th round on the roster. Is the ability to get open that hard to scout? Great performance from Shakir yesterday. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that I take this back to the scouting piece of it. I think so much with receivers is the fit, right? How this player fits into the style of offense you want to run and what you want your receivers to do. And then it's about skill sets and how skill sets play together to run your passing offense and how they work with your quarterback, and then opportunity. I've said this a million times, or at least I've thought it a million times. I don't know if I've said it a million times, but I go back to Lee Evans, Bills wide receiver, and I think about him kind of playing in the same era of football as Marvin Harrison. And I always thought to myself, if Lee Evans played for the Colts with Peyton Manning and Marvin Harrison played for the Bills with all those crappy quarterbacks, would Lee Evans be Marvin Harrison? Would Marvin Harrison be Lee Evans, right? Like, I feel like so much of that is based on your opportunity fit skill set. I think there's so much that goes into it. I don't think if you put Gabriel Davis on a different offense, he's the same player he is here. Just like Diggs is a great player, but Diggs wasn't this for Minnesota. He's a great player, phenomenal player, 1,000-yard receiver, but he wasn't this, right? So I just, for receiver, it's one of those positions where, certain guys are going to produce no matter what, but what that looks like in its entirety is really predicated on fit, skill sets, and opportunity. And I think the Bills, because they have Josh Allen, they're able to kind of unlock these receivers in ways that other teams can't. And it's not just young players. It's Stefon Diggs, obviously. We already talked about it. John Brown never had as good of a year as he did with Josh Allen. Cole Beasley, the consistency that he had with Josh Allen, better than anywhere else, right? There's a track record here. So I think the Bills structurally, based on their quarterback, based on how they use skill sets, have a really unique advantage in how they can unlock a receiver's ability to produce. BetOnline.net is your number one source for football betting information this season. You can find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. So head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. All right, we got some more to get to today. The next one comes from Brundy, who says, I was curious your input on the next show. Do you believe there's reason to worry about Case Keenum as our backup? I know he doesn't get a lot of first-team reps, but it always seems like he's not very sharp when he comes in for Allen. Praying we never need to find out, but still. Do you think the Bills look to improve that position next year? Yeah, I think Case has had that. He had the one good preseason game, and then he's been kind of on every other exposure we've had to him. So I don't sit here with like oozing confidence in Case Keenum's ability to come in and play at a high level, right? Like I think that's generally understood for most backup quarterbacks, but I think just lasering in on my exposures of him here, it's been pretty underwhelming outside of that one game that he looked pretty good. I think it's different when you game plan to play, right? And you're playing with the ones, right? Like that looks different. And we've seen Case Keenum do that at a reasonable level. So I think he's a reasonable backup quarterback. I'm not sitting here trying to tell you that he's one of the best backups in the league. I think he's a reasonable backup quarterback, especially for this team. That said, I think the Bills will look to go elsewhere after the season. Case is only on a one-year deal. And there's a lot of very interesting free agent quarterbacks next year that the Bills could look to as a backup, whether that's Sam Darnold or Baker Mayfield or Daniel Jones or Taylor Heineke or Cooper Rush, Jacoby Brissett. There's a lot of guys out there. And so I think you'll want to look down that road for your backup next year and maybe move on from Case, to be honest with you. But hopefully we never see it. Hopefully the Case Keenum that we get to see in future weeks is just like the one we saw against Tennessee in Pittsburgh. Free Fallen says, how do you take notes when watching a game? I like to take my own notes to be a better student and fan of the team, but don't know where to start. I think that's a good question. I think you got to find out what works for you, right? Everybody learns differently. Everybody retains information differently. So what works for one person might not be for everyone. I'll say this about me and watching Bills games. I don't really take a lot of notes. I might write a few things down from time to time that I want to remember to say on the podcast, but I just don't. I think I have a great resource at my disposal. My brother, Frank, we watch games together and we discuss them throughout the contest, and we talk about strategy. We talk about what the Bills are trying to do, what other teams are doing to the Bills. And that's big for me to be able to kind of take those discussions and tie them into what I want to say on the podcast. So I kind of have this very dedicated 3.5 hour stretch of time where I'm locked in on the Bills, and I'm able to retain a lot. And also I lean heavily on the game book and going and looking at the play-by-play and the scripts and the numbers and tying that all back to the discussions that I have with my brother throughout the game. So that's kind of what I do. And that's what works for me. Other games that aren't the Bills, I'm mostly watching for scouting purposes, not necessarily scheme purposes. And so when I'm watching other games and I'm trying to pay attention to other players, I just make notes on skill sets more than anything. What traits do I see from players that stand out? So I think I'm a very good note taker in some components of my life, but I don't think watching live broadcast football is an area where I have much to offer, to be completely honest with you. And I would say mostly because I have that great resource that is my brother Frank to kind of talk about these things throughout the course of the game and then apply them to what we talk about here on the podcast. The next one comes from Joe, not me, a different Joe. And before I get into my question here from Joe, I want to shout out Hannah. Hannah is a new football fan, is a listener to the podcast. learning a lot about the game. Her and Joe are bonding over football, and I love that. So, Hannah, thanks for listening, and I hope that you continue to love this game, fall deep in love with this game, because it is so good. It is so good, and the Bills are such a fun team. So you've entered the football community at the right time. So shout out Hannah and Joe. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Joe did have a question. He said, why do offensive linemen often stick their arm out before the play starts? Is it signaling who they're going to block? Thanks so much for the great content and for considering this question. Yeah, so there's a lot of communication out there. So when Josh Allen gets out there, he identifies the Mike linebacker. He'll say 55's a Mike, 41's a Mike, whoever the Mike is. And a lot of that, you set your play based on that, right? You set your protection based on the Mike. And so that requires communication from the offensive line, and there's a lot of pointing and communication that goes on from that. And there's also a lot of false keys, right? Like you want to do things up there to take the focus of the defense away from maybe formationally what you're doing or different tips that you have based on formation by communicating and pointing and saying things. Even when I played high school football and I was a right tackle in high school football, I would get up there and just say things that didn't matter. Like they didn't mean anything to anybody, but I would say, if I knew we were playing running a unique play, I would say a word about that to give them some type of false key that the next time we get back up there, we're going to run that play. And then the next time that I call that call, we won't do that, but they're going to think that we're going to do something else, and I get them out of position, right? So there's a lot that goes into that, to that piece of the game, but it's mostly just communicating with the teammates. And, that's a big part. That's a big part of playing O-line. You got to be able to have 5 guys working together as one. So it's just about communication. Last one today comes from OTP, who says, obviously, with such a deep team, there are lots of players now getting the recognition they deserve, but hold on, let me stop there. This defense didn't have any Pro Bowlers last year. Remember that? But I think it's fair. They are starting to get some recognition, but we still have some underrated people throughout the organization. Who do you think is the most underrated person in terms of national recognition throughout the entire organization? My mind goes towards the Pagulas for trusting the people they hired, both McDermott and Frazier, to many players like Teron Johnson, Matt Milano, Mitch Morse, and the list goes on and on. So how do you think, who comes to mind first? I think I go a lot more towards the players just naturally. I think people understand what Leslie Frazier and Sean McDermott and Ken Dorsey are. Maybe some of the assistant coaches, Bobby Babich, Jim Salgado, John Butler, as defensive coaches that are phenomenal at what they do. I think they deserve some recognition here. I think the Bills' medical staff is very, very good. How they embrace sports sciences, how they get players back on the field, how they do a lot to prevent injuries. And I know that doesn't sit well this year, but in previous years, the Bills have done well there. So there's a lot of really good operational things that happen here for the Bills. But players-wise, 3 guys come to mind for me. I'll give you 2 on defense and 1 on offense. I think you make good points there in Matt Milano and Teron Johnson. I don't think people understand what's on their plate. Teron Johnson is a starting slot corner in a base nickel defense. I mean, the guy does so much, right? Like in coverage, he's basically a linebacker at times, and he's a corner, like really a ton on his plate. He's one of the premier he's probably the best slot corner in the NFL. And do we talk about him like that? I don't think that happens, right? You hear about Kenny Moore, you hear about Mike Hilton, but my goodness, Teron Johnson's a stud. Matt Milano is phenomenal. Ton on his plate. The Bills linebackers, they're in this defense, they're asked to make the defensive line right. And sometimes there are some bubbles, there are some gaps, there are some formational things that put a lot on these linebackers, and Matt Milano sniffs it out so frequently. Obviously, I've talked a lot about his value in coverage, particularly against tight ends. And, do we talk about him as a Pro Bowl player? Doesn't really happen, but my God, I mean, Matt Milano should be firmly in the Pro Bowl radar for this year because he's a stud. Offensively, let me shout out Devin Singletary. I don't think anybody talks about him as one of the best backs in the league. They probably shouldn't, but this guy's been durable. He's been consistent. His production for the opportunity he's been given has been very good year over year. You heard the way Josh Allen talked about him as a teammate recently, the way Sean McDermott talked about him as a locker room presence. This is a really nice player for the Bills. And I think that you wish he was more explosive. Maybe you wish he was bigger, more dynamic receiver, all that stuff. But, I think what he does for this team is really good. And again, he's not going to have the production that you love from a premier NFL running back, but he's been really, really solid. Just go back and kind of look at his career and stack it up against other guys. His durability, his consistency has been a really big deal for this team, especially when you consider how many other backs have been here with him that don't do anything, right? Like Matt Breida, TJ Yeldon, Zach Moss, the way that he outshined Frank Gore earlier in his career. Devin just continues to kind of rise to the top, and I think he deserves some recognition for that. All right, folks, that's it for today on the podcast. Tomorrow, our primer on the Kansas City Chiefs. I'm going to break them down the best I can for you tomorrow on the podcast. So come on back. Don't miss it. Make sure that you're subscribed. We'd love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.